Good morning, BookTube. This is Emma Clarke coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I am joined as always by my special guest, The Highway. And The Highway on Sundays is quieter than on the rest of the week because half is shut down for human events. But the other side, especially where I live, is always going to be filled with trucks. And I live across from a distribution warehouse where the trucks love to toot a little greeting as they come by. Although even then, as I say that, I am anthropomorphizing those machines because it is the human operators who are doing the tooting so far. If they automate that process eventually, that will be a fiendish future indeed. The tension there in my statement just about my living context, I think perfectly reflects some of the themes that matter most in contemporary science fiction and are part of the reason that I so appreciate Clarkesworld in particular. Clarkesworld has many things going for it as a publication, but to the surprise of no one, considering I have published there a few times and definitely deal with similar themes when I do, is this holy triumvirate of tensions between human intelligence, such as it is, non-human animal intelligence, or non-human biological intelligence in general, and that intelligence can manifest in earthly creatures, whether they be floral or faunal, or in alien intelligences that we imagine to reflect some aspect of our world back to us. And the third prong of that triumvirate is the non-human synthetic or artificial intelligence. And the tensions between these three have really important implications for our sense of self, our sense of agency, our sense of community with other beings that might be considered to have agency, and systems that also have agency. So I do find that that holy triumvirate is extremely important. There are many publications in the genre, and they have different concerns. Some of them are much more interested on a kind of aesthetic unity. So the work will have a subject position that ties in with specific forms of political discourse or themes pursuant to specific fields in the real world right now that need our attention, whether it be climate change activism, which comes up a lot in our science fiction, or elements pertaining to human rights and ongoing marginalization of many people. So we have many forms of writing. There are, of course, also publications that are much more traditional with respect to being focused on plot, action. They'll often have a cadence that leans on thriller or crime, and a lot of more technical approaches to technology, by which I mean maybe not necessarily as interested in the implications of technology so much as using the objects in exciting ways. So we have a good range, and it is important to have a wonderful, thriving ecosystem. But outside of the network of short fiction publications right now, we also have a lot of other pressures. And some of those are emergent from the strange pseudo-intelligence of our online ecosystem, which has presented a bit of a lie. It has manifested the myth of meritocracy in some very painful ways, because online you have the sense that the world is at your fingertips and now we can finally bring in the world and everybody has a shot. And yet the reality is that all literature is regional literature. It reflects a community, it reflects a context. And even though the internet gives the impression of true global community, it is extremely difficult to see that impression play out in a lot of speculative fiction's most prominent venues. What I enjoy about Clarkesworld is that all of the content you read comes up through slush. There are no authors being solicited for stories just to be able to use their name for branding to try to sell the work, which is something that was very common to science fiction in different eras and created a context where certain authors would get grandfathered in. As I've mentioned, I've been published many times in Clarkesworld, and I will emphasize that after publication or after being accepted for certain stories, I might then be rejected for another story, because I am always in competition with the breadth and depth of excellence in the slush pile, which is wonderful. I find that invigorating, and I find that to be something that improves my practice. And in the cover art as well, you will always see all the names of the fiction authors laid out, and there's no hierarchy there either. Everyone is part of something wonderful together. The difference as well is that there are actual slush piles, and this is going to matter when we get into the editorial, because it is a challenging thing to run a slush pile. There is a material body of elements that are required to pull one off effectively, especially year-round. Many publications have very narrow windows when you can submit your work, and unfortunately, some of the most prominent spaces in our genre don't have submission windows at all. How do they get their work? Again, regional literature. So if you know the right people, if you have been to the right workshops, if you've paid to go to the right conventions, you will probably be able to network and ingratiate yourself into the presence of many editors who decide the future for writers in the genre. And if you can't do that, you probably are going to be on the margins. It's very difficult to get in without geopolitical connections. And that's just the way of it. Again, all literature is regional. The struggle is that science fiction has this aspirational tendency. It tries to present itself as something more, something universal, something expansive. It seems to be thinking about the world in grander ways. But those don't manifest in the material realities of the actual industry, because it is an industry, it is still a product. And that leaves us with a question, a really big, pressing question. We who claim to be dreaming the better dreams, imagining the world to come in ways that will hopefully inspire, are we doing enough to make those worlds manifest in the real world? Or is it just something that we ape on the page, that we perform hoping to get ours in these very tight, scarcity-driven economies? A publication like Clarkesworld is always trying to open itself to more of the world in a way that is inclusive, that doesn't make people feel pigeonholed into certain representations, and it has an open slush pile, and it pulls directly from the slush pile, but it is struggling, and we will talk about that with the editorial again. So we have to think about how we fund our industry, how we invest in the dreams that we perform on our own pages as being important. Are we actually ready to imagine a better world? Tough question. So let's not answer it right away. Let's go into this issue. So this latest issue, May 2024, has cover art that not all of you will be able to see. For those who cannot, we have a top-down aerial view of exactly what I was talking about. It's the Holy Triumvirate is present in this image. So again, these really beautiful pieces of work reflecting the thematic concerns of a lot of the content therein. This top-down aerial view gives us a human astride a mechanical construct. It is a marine vehicle. You might think kayak immediately, but there is actually a mechanical component, so it does have a motor, and yet it has these sprawling ballasts on all sides that make it look like a lot like many kinds of animals that can skip across the surface of lakes and ponds. And so even though on first glance it has this perfect geometric symmetry to it, this elegance that seems designed and controlled in a very human way because it was built by humanity, the elements around it remind us that it still is of nature. The design is something that is emulating what already exists in nature. And when I say the elements around it, it's the wildlife around it. So we have the human on top of this machine that is inspired by a very natural design for certain species. On top of the water surface and under the water surface, we have this looming, probably a whale, massive figure in the depths. And then on the construct as well, on the vehicle, we also have other forms of wildlife. So everything is in sync. We've got the human, we have the non-human animality, and we have the non-human, not intelligence necessarily, but the mechanical part of our world. All are beautifully juxtaposed in this piece called Strider by Ilya Nazarov. So an absolutely wonderful manifestation of the themes, a lot of sci-fi in the issue and beyond. In the issue, we have 8 pieces of fiction. We have our 1 nonfiction essay, and we have 2 interviews with writers, care of Arley Sorg, before the editorial by Neil Clarke. The first story, Alice Towey's Fishy, is a perfect reminder of what happens when something suddenly becomes very familiar in the genre. We now have a tried and true story style about an artificial companion to a human who is maybe passed on or is no longer there, and that companion is waiting in the space until someone else comes along, and that other person might be trying to connect with the past life in some way, and this companion's going to help them do that. We've had other pieces like this even this year in this issue. It is now becoming a very seasoned trope within sci-fi. It's not a matter of repetition is wrong at all. It's quite the opposite. This is becoming a standard mode to tell stories, just the way that we have many other conventions and other fairy tales, fables. This is now a convention manifesting as an extension of how normal it is to talk about artificial companions in our culture. So what does that do for us? It allows us to play with variation and to see through variation many different aspects of ourselves within a format that we recognize as familiar, without it necessarily being, it's not a ripoff anymore. It's just a convention. It's just now part of the vocabulary of science fiction. This story, Fishy, has the titular character Fishy as an artificial companion for a scientist, an engineer, an inventor who has passed on. And his daughter comes to his office to try to find the last part of his legacy, the invention that he had been talking about that was going to change the world. She's not as interested in money. She really wants to honor her father's vision, but she can't find the prototype. So readers will know almost immediately, oh yeah, Fishy's probably got the prototype, if Fishy isn't the prototype. But the story is not so much about that surprise. There is a tension between Ada, the daughter, and a partner of her father's in life who is very much more of the, we have this classic binary within a lot of tech industries in real life, where we have one person who is the inventor, the person who creates, and then the other who markets and sells out. And so Murphy is also looking for the prototype, and there is something really nice and clever about the design of Fishy here. If Fishy could speak in the same way that we do, this story would be over very quickly. But Fishy is a limited intelligence, and that does create just enough friction for the intrigue, who's going to find it first and what's going to happen after. So again, we now have this new fabulous format, the idea of the artificial companion that outlives the human and then becomes, as a result, a bridge to the next generation. And it's played out here in a distinct way, in a fun way, while also leaning on the fact that this is now the new vocabulary that many of us use to talk about how things survive us and how our own legacy can survive through them. We might do in the end of the year a reflection on a few of these pieces if more of them emerge in future issues, but very common now in our genre. Okay, the next piece by Fiona Moore, The Portmeirion Road. This was a striking story for me to read as a writer, and sometimes I've mentioned that my writer brain will kick in when I'm reading something and I will resist aspects of the text. And then I think to myself about the points of resistance. So this is set in the near future. It's set in a world where our notion of society has somewhat collapsed and smaller surviving hyperlocal communities have emerged. It's not too far out because it has an awareness of the before times and what people used to do, where they came from before they lived in the ways that they do now. We have an older character with a struggle. There is someone in their community who's very sick and needs the help of a body of experts who are living in a slightly different way. And so she goes to pay them a visit, and she brings with her robot. And there is discussions about knowledge, about how barter works in this new economy, about the difficulty in this future space of making manifest knowledge through manufacturing processes, not always easy when bigger systems of the world fall apart. And there's the question of whose intelligence and whose life matters. Now, I do not agree with the protagonist's choices in this piece. And that's always fun. I think I've mentioned another story just this year where I vehemently disagreed with the protagonist's point of view. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it is at all a bad story. It is just a character who's making different choices. And as I was reflecting on this piece, I was thinking to myself, we as fiction writers are often expected to create more streamlined characters and more streamlined plots than the real world. We are made to conform humans in all of their inconsistencies and their cognitive dissonances into something that will seem to hold suspension of disbelief better on the page. And that's the same here. I really struggled with this protagonist because one of their main concerns was about whether the robot with her had agency and deserved to be protected and defended in the way of many other human lives and non-human forms of animality. And throughout, she keeps saying, I'm not going to anthropomorphize, I'm not going to anthropomorphize. But the robot has a human name, Seamus. It's already been anthropomorphized in some ways. It's not a number, it's not even listed as a kind of acronym, it's a human name. So you might consider that to be a contradiction, or it could be a manifestation of a protagonist who lives with a contradictory and confused sense of the world. And that I think is truer to humans. We are extremely fickle, but it is fun to see it play out in a story simply because we're not usually good at writing messy people and messy characters. And so we end up creating fictions that truly live up to that word by not really representing the actual human beings that they're trying to represent. It's a more idealized version of our thought processes and our outcomes. So an interesting piece in terms of imagining a near future reality with different approaches to knowledge communities. Okay, the next one by Carolyn Zhao, in which Caruth is correct. Now, this one made me chortle, which is a terrible thing sometimes to say about pieces involving trauma, but there is a section of this piece that seems to be poking directly at a lot of discourse online and a lot of westernized approaches to how we talk about trauma and difference in the individual. And I agreed with a lot of the underlying criticism about these different waves, these different movements of language used to try to quantify human experience. I live in a context that has a very different approach to terms of trauma because there is less power in words around trauma. A lot of what we have in the West, in Canada, United States, Britain, we have a wide array of labels that we can find through therapeutic pathways, through engagement with the healthcare and wellness industries. And we seek them out because they're necessary to navigate parts of our bureaucracy and our infrastructure for human agency, and because it's possible to seek them out and to leverage them for benefits within our industries. But in other parts of the world, they're not. It doesn't matter here in Colombia if you have the exact name for the kind of trauma you're living with, because at the end of the day, having that name is not going to entitle you to any better treatment within the system. So there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of power in the language we use around trauma. And in a few paragraphs, Zhao definitely calls our attention to exactly that phenomenon. And then moves on to present a different way of talking about trauma as time loops, as these moments that we can trip into that cycle us back to something else. And that's where the fun of speculative fiction comes in, because these time loops are literalized. And that's what creates the fantastical element of the piece, is imagining time loops as things that we can trip into or choose to trip into and then be caught in. And so this is a time travel story in a way that reflects on the language that we use and the way that we engage with the human experience of being caught in many different forms of disruption that might impede our ability to go forward, and might also just represent a way that we are going forward. So it's a lovely meditative story about the notion of trauma using an adjacent vocabulary, which is also something that science fiction does very well, by allowing us to reflect on a part of the real world through a slightly different vocabulary than we're used to. Okay, and the next piece, Thomas Ha's The Brotherhood of Montague St. Video, which I think would be a beloved piece, especially for, Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore. I had to remember the name of that piece, but it was from 2012, a lovely little novella with a little bit of a quirky mystery component to its understanding of text and memory. It stands on its own. I'm not saying that you have to go off and read the other work. It just belongs to a lovely thread of discourse that has these lovely little touchstones in our canon. In this piece, we have a protagonist who has a dead book. And you can tell, as a writer, sometimes you start with this concept, like, what does that mean? What would that mean? What would it mean for something to be dead? If it's not maybe a Kindle or a specific electronic device, what would it mean for a book itself to be dead? And so the story follows this world where there is a kind of sacred order of people who collect and preserve and negotiate and categorize many artifacts, material artifacts as well as digital artifacts that might otherwise be lost. What it is preserving, though, is something a little bit deeper, and it comes up as the core thematic concept in the piece. I've even got a paragraph to read from here, which has to do with the idea that many people do not enjoy the idea of something being fixed in time, the idea of having a concrete iteration of a book or another media item is antithetical to the way that a lot of people want to move through the world, and so it can become dangerous. And it does in this story with the protagonist's dead book, which is something fixed in a moment and iteration in a world that wants to move forward. So as one character says, people have a tendency to confuse change with improvement, so alteration seems like creation to some. The old man peered down the glasses dipping at the end of his nose. We like the feeling of progress, and folks figured out a while ago that you can always tweak things in your surroundings to heighten a perceived movement through time, even if in truth you haven't advanced anywhere meaningful at all. Now, if that doesn't reflect a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in the current moment, I don't really know what would. It definitely feels sometimes that we are enamored by the notion of progress. Now, the thematic concerns are different with Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore, but the gentle tone of the piece, the gentle sitting with the idea of a kind of fluidity between our digital media and our analog media with respect to deeper concerns about how we approach knowledge and continuity and memory. I think if you do recall the other novella, you'll probably enjoy this story too. Okay, the next one, Samara Auman's The Texture of Memory of Light is also working with memory, and you get this in Clarkesworld as you do in many other publications, a lot of resonance points within the same work. And so we have here a piece about memory enhancement tech, and with it there is, I would say, a three-part approach to memory in general. We have memory as something that is mental, sensory, can be augmented, it can be uplifted, but ultimately it is something that lies within us. And then two other forms of memory, material. In this case, we have somebody who's looking for their mother's robot arm, the last piece of her that remains after her death, and has a huge complicated story with it because it comes from an accident, it comes from a working life that was filled with a lot of exploitation. And then the third part of memory, our worldly actions, how we carry somebody's memory forward with us. So this story, even though it includes sci-fi components, especially in the memory enhancing tech, ultimately is an exploration of that tension between the three ways in which we remember and which we memorialize: the mental, the material, and the manifestation in our worldly actions. And in this case, inside the story, you have characters who vehemently disagree with the protagonist and how they carry forward the third in particular. But it's a struggle for all of us to find the balance that works best. Okay, the next story, yes, also the idea of how do we preserve memory. So there's definitely an abiding through line in this issue. Rajeev Prasad's The Blinding Light of Resurrection. In it, we have a character who is trying desperately to save his wife, who has been sick and has essentially been written off. She needs such dramatic care in order to be healed from her cancer that she would require her whole body to be reformed one piece at a time. 3D printing technology exists, but it is obviously something that one needs permission to be able to use, to be able to access, probably in relation to the cost of materials and the time for the machine as well. Shiv steals prints and designs in order to save his wife. And the question here is, what is he really saving in the process? He saves her body, but the choices he makes along the way lead to the destruction of other aspects of his life and hers. I still think personally the life still matters enough that it's worth it, but that is the tension in the story in terms of what would you sacrifice in order to preserve something else. And at the end of any process of transformation, can anyone expect that the person who emerges is going to be the same one that you were trying to preserve in the first place? So big questions there. The next one, we've got memory and grief all across this issue. Carlie St. George, The Weight of Your Own Ashes. Now this one, again, speaks to something that speculative fiction can do so well. We can start with a premise that seems to be otherworldly. This one has to do with non-human alien intelligence. So this is a very different species with a different way of thinking about life. And yet, as the story develops, you realize, oh no, this story is also very much speaking about migration and immigrant communities and people whose lives are scattered across the globe. So the species design on which this hangs is a species called Myriad, which has the ability to have multiple bodies and as a result multiple lives in different spaces. Now within the species, one thing I really enjoyed about this story is that there was actual diversity within the species. You have some people who like to cluster themselves together and not separate them. They believe that it's dangerous, reckless, foolish for somebody to scatter themselves across the galaxy. But others, like our protagonist, have said, what's the point of having these multiple selves if you don't experience more of life with them? And so our protagonist has spread their bodies across many contexts. But in one of those, they have a relationship with a human who perhaps is not prepared to be in a relationship with Myriad. They have one version of that person, and when that one body dies, they grieve that body as if the rest of them is also dead, as if they don't really know the rest of them. And it is this challenge for our protagonist to decide if the relationship that they have had with Alice has really been a relationship in which they have been known, or has Alice only ever really loved one part of them. And again, as the story goes along, you get these strong resonance points with respect to relationships where they love you, but only the side of you that they've seen within their cultural context. They're not ready to meet the rest of your family. They're not ready to meet the rest of your cultural community. They just want to focus on this one part. And they always insist, no, I love you, I love you, I love you, the whole you, but they don't really know the whole you. So this story is this beautiful blended metaphor using alien species and the idea of non-human other to get at something that's actually quite at the core of human experience. So well done, that piece. We also have KJ Khan's Our Father, which is the last of the fiction pieces, and it's a brief one, but it conveys a world. It has a generation ship, essentially, but wasn't really intended to be a generation ship. It has been sending off these beings to start and populate a new world atlas, except that on the journey, some of the people who are not supposed to be people yet, they were supposed to be born and grow when they get to the other side, start to gestate and grow in transit. And this means that there's a question: either they can be dumped, or one person can sacrifice their ability to be part of the new world, to be a caretaker for these lives along the way. And so it's this beautiful, loving story about someone who does that. Brief little piece that meditates on what it means to live a life of value and to be part of the journey of civilization. So that ends the fiction components. Then we again have Xiaolin's Spires has another nonfiction piece, and this one, Hive Minds and Drones, Bees in Space in Real Life and in Science Fictional Cosmos, covers a range. There's some wonderful discussion about bees in real-life spacefaring experiments. There's discussion about the honeycomb structures that are used in the James Webb telescope and other ways in which bees have inspired NASA tech in the real world. And then we move on to the fantastical, the notions of the hive mind and alien bees being connected with apologies, pollination and color patterning. Bees in other kinds of multimedia and video games as well. Oh, I'm so close to the end of this, so I'm not going to restart. The point of an article like this is to give us more possibilities for our fiction, to see what's been done, to see the ways in which our world has been manifested accurately in fiction, in a very precise way, and also in more metaphorical ways as well. So it's not really about a kind of judgment, it's just showing the possibilities. And I find these articles can be absolutely wonderful and useful for writers, so I do recommend looking through Clarkesworld's archives to see other topics if you are ever at a loss for something to write about, because they can trigger a lot of creative touchstones for us on our low days. Okay. And we have Arley Sorg's interviews. Okay. We have two authors, two Andreas actually today. So Hoodoo in Physics, a conversation with Andrea Hairston is the first. Andrea Hairston has a work coming out, Archangels of Funk, and the conversation with Arley goes from her start in as a math textbook editor to a full-time writer, and it also deals with her concurrent career in playwriting, which is, I think, an interesting touchstone. We have some writers who blend poetry and prose beautifully on the page. Playwriting is its own power because it definitely requires an ear for dialogue, obviously, and just cadence and rhythm in general, which can show up beautifully in our prose. And she considers herself an Afrofuturist in league with Indigenous futurists, so that gives you a sense of the overall enthusiasm and excitement in her world building. The last piece, Arley Sorg's Science Fiction as Science Communication, a conversation with Andrea Kriz, is about a writer with a strong start in science. Shock of all shocks. And they have a piece, Learning to Hate Yourself as a Self-Defense Mechanism. That is Kriz's upcoming short story collection. So she talks here with Sorg about the benefit of writing sci-fi while studying science, but in a two-way approach. The idea that science is useful, obviously, for people in general, and so it's wonderful to have fiction as a medium to communicate many of its concepts, but also Kriz recommends that scientists as well read science fiction, maybe to become better communicators and maybe to better understand the work they're doing as well. So it is a two-way street there. Okay. And as I mentioned, these reviews do tend to cover the range in careers. So it's really nice to see pieces that remind us that there are many ways in which we will intersect with fiction over the course of our career. And there are the vast majority of ways are not wrong ways. I'm not going to say there are no wrong ways, but whatever is yours, whatever is your path, there's probably an interesting story there too. Okay, so hopefully my voice won't give out completely before we get to the editorial. My goodness. The editorial I do recommend reading this month because it reflects on where we stand pretty much a year into the chaos that emerged after spam started to affect the submissions queues for publications like Clarkesworld. As I have mentioned before, Clarkesworld is a bit distinct in that it has an open submissions queue all the time. It does not solicit work to try to use brand names to promote an issue, and as a result, it relies on this open model to create the most vibrant, inclusive environment for writers coming up. It also makes it a huge target for spam. And this was before generative AI, but it got worse with generative AI last year. And so in this editorial, Clarke talks about the challenges in creating a procedure that won't burn out the back-end staff handling slush, and without falling prey to a lot of exploitative counter industries that have emerged to try promising companies, oh, we can weed out that spam for you, we can weed out that generative AI content. It's a delicate balancing act, and Neil Clarke is trying to manage it with a strong focus on ethics, a strong focus on ensuring ethical actors at every stage of the process, and of course trying to avoid the very painful situation of false positives, while also not veering too far to the other side of being in a state of suspicion all the time about content. So it's in progress. There's no magical solution. Neil Clarke's editorial this month is also thankful that it still doesn't need to be a bleaker summary of the state of the industry for the publication, but generative AI is not the only major problem that Clarkesworld has. Amazon, as a monopoly in our industry, has made it very difficult for us to get the funding where it needs to go if we want to support an ecosystem that's really focusing on vibrant work. As a result, we need to have better conversations about how we are going to support our industry, how we are going to support the work that we're doing, and how we are going to continue to push back against a scarcity mentality to create spaces that, while regional, because all literature is going to be regional at the end of the day, still tries its best to manifest the characteristics of science fiction that we put on the page. We might aspire to write about better ways of being and better ways of manifesting our own agency while uplifting others in our fiction, but we are still a long way from having developed industries in the real world, as well as general political practice that allows us to do likewise. Hopefully these publications and the stories that they share, like the rich array in this issue, will help us move forward and move in that direction, but it can only come out of, and I don't know why that came off because I had it in airplane mode. But the problem is not going to be fixed without us working together as much as we can to try to come up with better solutions. Okay, so chaotic recording today, but it is what it is. I hope there was something in here you enjoy. I hope you touch base with some of those issues, the issue contents this month. And if you like what you read, if you don't read Clarkesworld, if you read something else, I hope that you support whatever content resonates best with you. So best wishes, and thank you again for listening. Cheers.